Our new manga begins with the fact that one day from the sky came a huge red stone that struck the whole world. Then it collapsed in the middle of a mountain range in the central part of the empire of Ori. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A strange energy filled the world, turning it upside down. It was from that very day that some people began to gain extraordinary powers. For example, a child who had never held a sword before could split a rock with a single blow of a stick. And the village girl, with just a sweep of her finger, destroyed the hordes of monsters that attacked her village. The newfound power didn't care about a person's age, gender, class, and background. As a result of all this, the world that had not changed for many millennia began to change. A tense atmosphere hanging between those in power and those who had just acquired their new power. The leaders of many countries were in a quandary and needed to figure out how to deal with these gifted people. Among these countries was the Or Empire, who made a public statement on the matter. Then the empire declared that all persons who had previously gained power must come to the capital of the empire, and if a person can provide evidence of his special powers and swear to use them for the good of the empire, he will be honored with the right to join the cavalry. Naturally, the news spread like wildfire and spread all around, as people from all classes wanted to be honored. The news spread to all walks of life, from the poor to farmers, and even to a remote mountain village. It was in this village that a lad with an axe in his hand looked at the news and was very much surprised that it was possible to get into the cavalry. Then the story moves us 11 years into the future, where we can see a tortured man who looks very battered and whose hands are tied. It turns out this man's name is Udrain Isle, and he's currently exactly 31 years old. Apparently, he's in a courtroom. There, the judge asked that he listen to him carefully, and also names the man as the accused. According to him, the man is a criminal who neglected his duties as a cavalry commander, invaded the forbidden sanctuary, and tried to steal the world sphere. Moreover, according to the judge, this man was involved in many incidents such as the assassination of Duke Pellet 9 years ago, the destruction of the Pearl Tower which happened 7 years ago, and the rebellion on the Red Field which happened 5 years ago. All while noting that the man dared to come out with unthinking statements that he was acting for the good of the world. At this point, Judrain was on his knees, having heard all the accusations against him. He only grinned and thought about the words that had been spoken in his direction. It turns out that, in his opinion, there were quite a few signs that indicated that something very bad might happen in the world soon, from which he was trying to save the world. The man very clearly felt that something serious was coming, but no one would listen to him, so he decided to do everything on his own. But the judge is not going to stop. He accuses the man of, among other things, trying to escape by joining with other countries when the truth about his actions came out. Immediately afterward, the judge asked him if the man agreed with the charges against him. Then he looked up, and looking at the hall, he thought for a moment. He suddenly wondered if anyone present really wanted to know the truth about what was going on. Instead of a predetermined answer, he looked at the entire audience that was in his court. But suddenly he realizes that whatever they believe in, the world will not collapse, because everything can be solved by the mere execution of a commoner, an unmade Omega, who dared to conspire behind their backs. It becomes clear that these thoughts are quite mocking the behavior of these people. Then he turned his head and noticed that the emperor's throne was empty. He also realized that although there were a lot of spectators, it was only a modest ceremony that the emperor didn't see much point in attending. But he still realizes that if he thinks in more detail about everything that has happened, much has been lost. In the name of serving the common cause, he recalls the moment he bowed to the emperor, and also the moment of the battle with a very scary monster that wanted to kill everyone who stood in its way. The man remembered what high status he had until that moment. After the data and memories came over him, his hands clenched into a fist, he lowered his head, and we learn that he thought that when the time came, he would die without any regrets. But it turned out not to be like that at all. Then the judge interrupts the man's thoughts and says that history has never seen someone so vicious. He says he is surprised that the perpetrator has not expressed any remorse for committing such serious crimes, and thus betrayed the trust of the emperor and the entire empire. He also emphasizes that His Majesty the Emperor has fallen ill from the shock caused by this man who held such an important office, and accuses Judrain of having no concept of honor and dignity. Immediately after this monologue, The judge says that in order to atone for the gravity of the deeds this man has committed, he is sentenced to death, and today he will be executed by hanging. Naturally, he declares that this will be done for the glory of the just emperor, whereupon he begins to praise him. After a short time, the Judrain was taken outside the courtroom and was about to be hanged in front of the crowd that was peacefully watching. When the protagonist was about to be hanged in a noose, he realized that everything looks very strange, because he should be shedding bloody tears from the grief that he now feels. But in fact, he does not even feel angry about what is happening. He can't understand why he feels so calm, but suddenly he realizes that he has normal feelings, because he thinks it's ridiculous to worry about the future if he's going to die and disappear anyway. Then, looking at the sky, he says that he now understands everything, and he is just very tired. After a short time, he was already hanging on the gallows, while his death was unpleasant and not painful. In the next shot, a young guy wakes up in bed. He looks at his hands in surprise, and we learn that his name is Yudo, and he is only 20 years old. He wondered what was going on. He immediately noticed a bird on the window, and also noticed that he was in a dilapidated dwelling that was ready to collapse at any moment. It is also embarrassing that he is wearing cheap clothes made of coarse fabric and shoes specially bought in store. He realizes that this is the very moment when 11 years ago he first left his home and arrived in the capital. The guy tying the laces on his shoes wondered, was everything that was happening an ordinary dream? Thinking it was really a terrible dream, he decided that it was indeed a terrible nightmare then, for it was in it that he saw his future from beginning to end from the moment he arrived in the capital. However, he is still disturbed that the dream was too detailed. Apparently, he even feels the pain he felt when he was hanged. Realizing that the dream was very realistic, he tries to understand what else he has to think about in this case. Except that someone used magic to bring him back 11 years. He even suggests that it may be God who took pity on him in his dying hour. But he immediately decides that it is impossible, because whatever powers you do not possess to turn back time 11 years, simply impossible. Feeling confident in his thoughts and guesses, Guy. After all, he knows very well that sometimes the Almighty did indeed manifest power through his followers. But never before had there been any mention of a miraculous rescue of a man from the clutches of death, much less his sending him back in time. Then, looking at his palms, he saw the fire beginning to glow there. He realized that it would seem that his future was forever lost. The moment he fully realized everything, his hands trembled with delight and amazement, suddenly lifting all the plates and glasses that were around him into the air. The guy wondered if there was a difference between the power then, 13 years ago, when it had just awakened in him, and now. He thinks that now that there are no monsters or work, he can safely go to another country and rapidly build up his power there. He even assumes that he will probably be able to find out more about the causes of the changes in the world to prevent them, because of the fact that in a few years in this world will gradually begin to appear a rift. And then it is after the appearance of this rift together with it will begin to change, and the climate, as a result of which many natural disasters will break out, and the divine gift will eventually lose its power, after which the peaceful day unseen before the creatures, monsters that will hunt people. Naturally, such a number of unexpected events will lead to mad panic and distrust among the people, and these actions will be followed by a huge number of other events that will change history. But still, to deal with this alone for the guy will be completely impossible. But now important people with great influence are still alive, so he is sure if you ask them for help in advance, most of the problems can be solved. Immediately after these thoughts, he realizes where he should go first thing. But suddenly, looking in the mirror, the guy stopped and wondered who would even listen. Pity his commoner? Because in the end, to convince someone in his words, he will still need power and status. Right after he realized this, the guy came out of his room and saw a young guy and an older woman on the stairs. The man on the stairs was a little surprised at the sight of the protagonist, but without betraying it, he went outside and started washing his face. Turns out the Cavalry Corps was the first system that was introduced into the Org Empire, thanks to the current emperor who had a special regard for awakened people who were found to have powers. It was after this that other similar organizations were already established, but due to the fact that many of them came too late, there was an inevitable gap between the ruling forces and the awakened ones. In other words, it is impossible to find a better place than the Cavalry Corps. And besides, there are enough people to whom you can ask for help in the future. Realizing all this, the protagonist decides that that is where they should go first, because as long as he does not go the same way as last time, there should be no problems. At this point, from the back of the protagonist calls the guy from the stairs, and calls the new guy. He immediately said that the owner of the guest house had informed him that the protagonist also had some powers. Smiling at Yudo, he immediately asked if he had come here to take the exam to be held at the Imperial Palace. Seeing a very indifferent interlocutor, the guy from the stairs immediately asked the protagonist not to worry about it, because he also came here to take the exam. He asks the protagonist if it would be easier to have a companion with whom he can share information, and then he immediately extends his hand and asks if Yudo wants to meet him. Then he says that his name is Hakein Vollenwald. Hearing this name, the protagonist thought about it. He remembered what happened in his future. After briefly thinking about it, he realizes that this guy must be the victim of the monster he saw in his future. And it was him with a smile on his face that the monster ate. It turns out that this happened just a year after his enrollment in the Cavalry Corps. Remembering that the guy is a good person, the protagonist immediately tells him that his name is Yudo and shakes his hand. Gakane is very happy to meet new acquaintance and informs the protagonist that just now he was thinking of having breakfast and therefore wonders if his new friend wants to go with him. Hearing this, the protagonist thought a little and nodded his head. He then agreed to the proposal and said they would go together. While they were having lunch, Gakane asked Yudo how he thought the food tasted. He asks if the main character tasted good and informs him that he has tried everything on the menu, so he can confidently say that this is the best combination. It turns out that Gakane was born into a very famous and influential family, and he has a good reputation and outstanding abilities. This is all the information that the protagonist remembers about this young man. Then the unsuspecting Gakane said that they put a lot of meat, and also every morning they bake bread, so all the food in this place turns out so delicious. Looking at him, the main character realized that if you think about it, he has always been a very good person. At this moment, he even thought about the fact that the boy had probably realized that he was a commoner, but had not expressed the slightest dislike or aversion to his person, and had even voluntarily checked into this old and run-down place. At that moment, Gakane says that he is very glad to meet his comrade, and then the protagonist realizes that in his previous life he had a chance to meet this guy here, and then he greeted him in the same way. Only last time the action took place in a different place. But last time everything turned out completely different, because at that time the protagonist ignored everyone who approached him inappropriately, because he had almost no experience in dealing with other people, and he did not want to communicate with anyone when he did not even know if he could ever return home. But now, everything has changed, because he got new skills to communicate with people. So he met a guy. At lunch, Gakane said that he is from South Ulan and came to this place a week ago. He also said that he was a little afraid that he could not meet someone before the exam, but now he is very happy that he was able to meet the main character. At this point, the protagonist realizes that apparently his new friend has always been like this, very charming and very sociable. Hearing the story he was told, the protagonist also decided to open up. Then he told his newfound friend that he came here from the central region. Of course, this wording surprised his friend a bit, and he immediately asked from which one, naming the zones of the central region. But the protagonist interrupted him and said that he came here from Eric. When Gakane heard about it, he was very surprised. He immediately asked if it was about the place near the mountains Rick. The knowledge of the area where the protagonist came from surprised him a little, but the guy said that it was impossible not to know about it, and asked if he knew correctly that that is where the red stone fell. When the protagonist nodded and his new friend was very surprised, and asked if the guy had seen the stone that fell to earth from heaven. Realizing that it was indeed true, he was very surprised, and asked his new friend if he was serious about it. Also, the guy says that he heard that His Majesty's knight and emperor had fenced off the area so that no one could even get close, and so he doesn't understand how the guy managed to see the stone. He assumes that the stone could have fallen near the protagonist's house, and so he asks about it. Without waiting from Fett, he immediately asks what that stone looks like and whether it is big. But then the protagonist humbly said that that stone looked like the most ordinary one. He even noticed that it was the same color as any other, and it was only the size of a fist, which naturally surprised Gakane a bit, and he even asked if it was true or if that stone was that small. Then the guy asked a new question to the protagonist and asked how he recognized in him the name of the red stone that fell from the sky. He asked if he understood correctly that it was all about its red color. At this point, the protagonist thought a little bit, but then the guy asked him if the protagonist was registered for the exam. From the face of the protagonist, it was clear that he did not do it. And then his new friend said that to sign up for the offensive, need to go to the Palace of the Blue Crown, and also says that he has already been there recently and can say that it will be a long way to go from here. But the guy once again shows his good intentions and says that he can guide the protagonist. After all, so it will be easier for him to find the right castle. The whole one can get lost on the way. Naturally, the protagonist agrees to this proposal, and then his friend tells him that this is the right choice. After a short time, the friends had already arrived at Paklamanutea, namely the Palace of the Blue Crown. Gakane immediately pointed out to the protagonist on the queue, which according to him for registration, and also reports that the guys are lucky because the queue is not as long as it could be. He thinks that today may even get a quick skip. At that moment, some girl who looks very excited turns to them and looks at her friends. Clenching her fist, she looks at the guys and asks them with a kind of anger if she correctly realized that they are also participants. Seeing her for some reason, Gakane got a little worried, but at the same time, he was not confused and said that everything is correct, and said that he had already submitted his application, at which point the girl asks if she understood correctly that he is here to help his friend. But then the girl says that if the guy applied, then he probably knows what to answer during registration. And so she asks him to tell her the correct answers. Suddenly, the girl clutches her stomach, which makes strange noises. She immediately says that she was so nervous that she hadn't eaten anything since morning. But Gakane reassures the girl and says that there is nothing special here. She just has to give her name, age, origin, and secondary gender, if any. And the most important thing at the end is to show her ability. Naturally, the girl didn't really understand what the guy was talking about, namely just the private sex. She immediately asked what it was, and then the guy that it was the new sign that appeared after the fall of the red stone. He also notes that it seems to mostly manifest itself in those in Comprobital, so the item is a must, at which point the protagonist listens intently to their conversation and is a bit thoughtful. Turns out he had a secondary gender too, for in his past life it was only a few months after he joined the cavalry corps when suddenly his secondary gender began to manifest. It turns out that no matter what your primary sex was, if your secondary sex was defined as alpha, you could easily impregnate someone who turned out to be omega, and people of the same sex can still pair up. However, those with the secondary gender experience an inevitable attraction to each other. At this point, the main character also remembers some young guy with white hair. Supposedly, this guy is the Emperor. It also turned out that at first glance, everyone thought that there was nothing special about it, and only as time went on and more facts came to light, discrimination between these people began to grow. The alphas were rumored to have good physical shape and strong awakened abilities, which earned them the admiration of the people, while the omegas, on the other hand, were weaker than even those awakened ones whose secondary sex never manifested. Compared to the rather calm racing of the alphas, the heat omegas were despised, for they could not withstand the attraction, resembling beasts rather than men, at which point the boy clenched his fist. It turns out that it was for this reason that when he was an omega, he became a cavalry commander in the whole country. There was a big fuss. At that time, people laughed at him, because even in their opinion, he would not be able to restrain himself during heat. According to people, the strength of the cavalry commander should be used only for the good of the empire. But everyone was still surprised that he was an omega, surpassed the strength of any alpha. According to people, it was incredible from any angle, but they still did not understand whether the odorless omega can even be called as such. Then, after a short thought, the girl also asked if it was obligatory to show her ability. Realizing that it was so, she immediately said that in this case, she was in a very bad position. Of course, the guy did not immediately understand why this was so, and immediately asked her about it. Then the girl said that her ability was not quite ordinary, and not knowing how to say it, said that it required a certain amount of training, and the result was not immediately visible. Naturally, this surprised Hakine, and he immediately asked if this kind of power was true, because he had heard that either visible magic or sword magic was common. But the protagonist was not surprised at all, and pushing his friend away a little, immediately asked the girl what her ability was. Then the girl said that she can read information from everything she touches. At first, even the main character, who has already lived one life, asks how it is possible. But then the girl says that when she holds an object in her hand, then in her head begins to receive different information about it. She immediately decides to give an example to make guys realize what she is talking about, and says that if that object is a book, then she will tell its content and name the author. But at the same time, she considers it a problem, because it seems to her that it is possible only if there is something to read from, and with new objects and her power practically does not work. And vice versa, the older and bulkier the object, the more time it takes to read. She immediately says that so far, this is all the information she has learned about her new power, at which point the protagonist, who is very surprised by this ability, immediately asks if the girl's ability works in public. Of course, she is very surprised by this question and says that she has never been able to do this before. Hearing this answer, the protagonist thought a little, but seeing the reaction of the girl, he realized that her words do not look like a lie. But this ability is ideal for real liars, because in the past, this girl has probably already refused to register. The main character then immediately hands the bracelet to the girl and asks her to try to read it. Of course, she is a little surprised, and a little nervous immediately says that her ability may not always work. But when she looked at the bracelet, her face immediately changed. She immediately said that this bracelet was made by an old man, and suggested that this man could be the grandfather of the protagonist. Then the guy immediately said that it is indeed so, and his friend was very surprised by this ability. But the girl wasn't going to stop and immediately said that the guy got this thing 7 years before the main character's grandfather passed away. She also recognized the main character's name, which she immediately asked him about. The guy was surprised by this ability, because the girl actually managed to read the information about the owner of the object. He thought about it for a while and started to remember his past life. It turns out he remembered that just a few years before his death, he had heard that King Dubon had found an awakened man who had the gift of seeing the future and reading objects. But the rumors had time to spread as the awakened man was already involved in the war and died, and there was no other information about him other than the fact that he was from the Igor Empire. He suggests that maybe this girl was the man. Then, without giving much of a look, the protagonist told the girl that her ability was real, and she wasn't lying about being able to read objects. At which point, the girl got a little angry and said that it was really true. But the guy wasn't going to get rid of the turnovers, and looking at the girl said that he assumed the commission was unlikely to believe it. At which point, his friend tried to stop him so as not to offend the girl. But the main character does not stop and decides to help the girl. He asks her to listen to him and gave her advice. He advised her that once she is asked about the ability, she should answer so that she is not asked to show it. He also said that she should in no way say what she told them, and should just say that she has immense destructive power. Naturally, this surprised both his friend and this girl. Then Yudo said that the committee can only accept applications, and they will not ask to show a power that would be difficult to test indoors. And the ability to read information can also be used to surround enemies, and it all depends on how to use it. So what the girl says is not a lie at all. And then during the final exam, the girl just needs to correctly tell the examiners about her power, and also asks to bring some old item to confirm their words. He also informs that to begin with, it will be enough just to successfully pass the registration. Naturally, the protagonist tells the girl that if this time nothing will work out, she may not have another chance. These words touch the girl, and she looks at the protagonist with surprise. The girl immediately says that what the guy told her is pretty amazing, but she still doesn't know if she can do it. And then the main character says that it depends on how much she wants to get into the cavalry corps. Then Gakane confirms the words of his friend and says that he said everything is correct, and the commission really only accepts applications and does not conduct the exam itself. And if you do not pass the registration today, it will be the end of it. These words stirred the girl's mind, and she boldly declared that in this case she would do exactly as the protagonist advised her. And she also thanked him for his advice. Then suddenly the girl remembered that she forgot to introduce herself, and said that her name was Kana. Naturally, the guys immediately also introduced the girl. Right after that, Kana said that she hoped that they would all successfully pass an exam and meet in the cavalry corps. To Gakane's mind, That sounded not bad at all. But by the time they finished talking, the queue had already ended, and the guard said that the next participant could go through. The girl immediately turned around and saw that there was no one else but them, and realized that it was her turn. As she climbed the stairs, the guys cheered her on as best they could, and Gakane told her not to worry, for they would be cheering for her. The girl thanked them in return. Then, after the girl left, Gakane looked at the protagonist and asked him if he was worried. But the protagonist confidently said that he wasn't at all, and he was fine. Then, seeing his friend's calmness, Gakane said that he was indeed difficult to understand. But among all those whom he had seen, he had the best chance of passing the exam without difficulty. But immediately he replied that he would definitely pass the exam, at which point his friend laughed, noting that he was very confident, and jokingly asked if he could see the future, and that was his ability. Then he jokingly asks what about him, and whether the protagonist knows anything about his future. But Juno immediately says that although he can't see into the future, he is sure that his friend will pass the exam too. Naturally, the calmness of the protagonist surprised his friend a bit, and he immediately slapped him on the head, saying that even such nice things he still says with an indifferent face. At that moment, the guard calls the next one, and the protagonist looks at his friend with incomprehension, who says that it seems to him that it's finally the protagonist's turn. Gakane then mumbled that he would be waiting for the protagonist at the entrance, and wished that he would return soon. The exam could not be held on the same day due to the large number of applications from Miord, a huge number of people who awakened and became the happy owners of new abilities, waiting for the end of the exam and the announcement of the result, among them and the protagonist. He thought that unless something out of the ordinary happened, the results of today's exam would be announced at once. Only a moment later, he saw his friend. Despite him, he assumed that everything had happened as he had thought before, and he had already passed the exam. At that moment, some woman distracts him and asks for the next participant to enter the examination room, which turns out to be the protagonist. When we enter the room, we find out that the guy was assigned the number 423, and he was finally able to appear before the leaders who were deciding whether the student would pass the exam or not. Looking at everything around him, the protagonist realized that the hall and the examiners were still the same, and realized that as far as he could remember from his past life, there were 5 of them. Among them, there were some rather high-ranking people such as the deputy commander of the Imperial Order, the assistant to the Muker General, the mage representative who had been sent from the Pearl Tower, the court mage, as well as another person who looked more majestic than the rest and who hadn't been introduced to us. Suddenly turning to the protagonist, he is asked whether he told the full truth about his abilities and skills, as he stood out among all the other participants by describing in detail all his abilities. Based on this, the committee assumes that he may have lied. Looking at the questionnaire of the protagonist representative of the mages outraged and asked whether it is really possible to put fire and water in one sword, he immediately says that this is the first time they have heard of such a thing, and considers it absurd. According to him, magic is a very complicated process that requires careful preparation, during which it is difficult to accumulate manu and use it in practice. And that is why, according to him, even one single use of it requires caution and great strength. And especially according to the mage, it concerns the combination of magic of different attributes. According to him, too much time and effort will take to get used to the way of moving mana from one attribute to another. And so he asks the protagonist if he knows that the mana thus stored in the body can collide and explode, while the protagonist listens attentively to the examiner. And after a short time, he realized that for them it was just empty words, because so far there was no such awakened among all the others. In his own words, he specifically mentioned only one possibility of using water and fire, but the conversation still starts to drag on, at which point the emperor-like man says that if there is any truth in what the guy says, then let him prove it here and now, and thus show his power. This young man also says that it is necessary for them to believe in all the words of the guy. Naturally, the protagonist, who realizes the power that he has, immediately agrees to the proposal. He heads over to the weapons stand and grabs for the sword to demonstrate his power. After he grabbed, suddenly around the sword, he looked at the examiners and said that in that case he would begin his introduction. After a short time around, the ball appeared not only flames but also water, Naturally, such a very much surprised the very magician who tried to belittle the achievement of the protagonist. He immediately stood up from his seat, and with a surprised face asked how this is possible. But the protagonist was not going to stop, and continued to swing the sword. He realized that now he was in perfect shape, and therefore will be able to show his skills. He only worries that in his past life his mana flow was pierced and his arms and legs were broken, so that he couldn't use his magic. But now that he is well, the young man realizes that he can show everyone his true power. He starts to emphasize the ball, and then the sword split between fire and water, which looked very unusual. What he saw surprised all the examiners already. And the magician who doubted the main character's abilities said that he is indeed able to freely wield various attributes. At which point, the main character asks that he now be allowed to prove that this water is real, and asks if any of the examiners want to touch it. Naturally, the examiners could not have expected such a thing, and one of them asks if he correctly realized that the protagonist is offering them a touch of his power. At that moment, another examiner asks if it is safe. The magician who tried to devalue the protagonist's skill says that no one would dare to take such a risky step. But these words did not stop the emperor, who stood up from his seat, and looking at such a unique opportunity said that if no one wants to do it, then he will try it himself. Naturally, the people who were there tried to somehow oppose the emperor's decision and dissuade him from doing so, but they of course failed to do anything. The protagonist at this moment realized that the emperor himself was coming to him, because just now the deputy commander of the order addressed him as the real emperor. He realized that, as expected, his real identity is different. It turned out that this young man is the first commander of the cavalry corps and the Duke of Pellet, and this young man's name is Cassiar Laor. As he looks at the guy, the protagonist realizes that no matter which way he looks at it, this guy has a really complex magic of disguise, and he could have been fooled if he hadn't seen him in a similar guise before. Remembering a moment from his past life, the protagonist realizes that he could not have expected that so soon he would meet a man whom he had previously killed with his own hands. Looking directly at Yuno, Cassiar says that he finally saw something interesting, but then the protagonist asks him not to touch the sword blade, but only the water that is there. Naturally, Cassiar agrees to this for safety reasons. When he finally decided to touch the water suddenly splashed him in the face, causing everyone else in the exam hall to startle and even shudder in fear that something might have happened to him. But the Duke himself immediately calmed his subordinates and said that he was fine. At this time, they were still trembling with fear, but the Duke himself said that it was really real water, and the guy was just emphasizing that everything was exactly as he had stated. At this point, the smiling Duke says it's quite interesting, because the guy has a remarkable ability that is as fearless as its owner. Hearing these words, the protagonist said that it comes out in this case he failed the exam, since he was not afraid. But the Duke says that this is by no means true, because he is not allowed to miss such a talent. Then looking at the protagonist, he says that he certainly passed the exam. Hearing these words, the protagonist bowed to the Duke and thanked him for the honor, but the Duke said that he should not do so, because in the other side is the place of residence of those who passed the exam, and the guy will show everything. After the protagonist was about to leave this place, suddenly he was stopped. It turns out that man is the Duke, and majestically looking at the protagonist, he said that he would remember him. Then the Duke immediately says that they will see each other next. But at this point, the guy didn't say anything, and just looking at the Duke thought about something. After that, without giving any honor to the Duke, he turned around, and leaving thinking that they will surely still be able to meet, because now it is the Duke is the commander. The action is then moved forward a few days, and also to the Imperial Order Corps territory. There is a huge crowd there, which is distracted by a young man asking for everyone's attention. You can tell from his appearance that he is a servant of the commander, and he loudly announces that the commander himself is coming here. After being ordered to stand still, the commander himself appeared in public, and it turned out to be the same guy as the protagonist had said. The commander immediately said that he was very pleased to meet all these people, and loudly announced that he was the Duke of Pellet, and said that his name was Cassiar Laor. According to him, as the rest of the people can already notice, he is a member of the imperial family blessed by the power of light, and is also a duke. He then asks the people if it means anything to them, but immediately says that it certainly doesn't, for such things have no meaning in this place. According to him, there are 330 awakened standing here now, who have passed the first enrollment in the cavalry corps since its creation. The Duke says that he, like all the others who have gathered in this place, possesses the powers that awakened the red stone in them. And he also says that, being acquainted with His Majesty, he has been appointed his representative among all the awakened. He also says that the value of the cavalry corps is only in the safety and strength of their empire, and just as importantly in their own freedom. He says that they may not quite realize this yet and don't understand what it means, but he still hopes that in time they will come to understand it. Right after these words, the guy says that this is the end of his welcome speech and says that all people will be temporarily residing in the Imperial Order's territory until the Cavalry Corps building is completed. He also emphasizes that if they have any questions, they can come to the commander's office anytime they want. At which point, he says he has said all he wants to say. After that, one of the commander's servants told all the others to say goodbye to him. Of course, people who had never done it before did not understand how to do it properly and started bowing, with one of them saying that he had never had to learn this before and therefore did not know how to do it properly. Seeing the panic that is caused by the usual farewell to his commander, Cassiar turns to his favored Nadanu and says that he thinks they will have a lot of fun training these people. Suddenly, the protagonist is approached by an old acquaintance who is happy that Yuno was able to pass the exam, but Gakane immediately says that he passed the exam, and the girl they helped also passed. He also asks if the protagonist has accidentally seen the same girl, but the protagonist, still emotionless, says he hasn't. It turns out that according to Gakane, Kana wanted to thank the protagonist, and then the guy also says that in his opinion, they could have gone through everything together only thanks to the advice of the protagonist. Of course, it is a little confused Young who just keeps silent. Turns out he's been thinking about the fact that his friend has already had a chat with Akana and wonders how sociable this guy really is. Right after that, Gakine asks the protagonist where he was determined to live. And then we learn that the protagonist will live in the 36th room, which is on the 3rd floor. At this point, his friend happily said that now they will be roommates, because he is also determined there. But besides them, there will be 2 more guys, and so they wonder who they are and went to see them. At this point, a joyous Gakane says that now they are really like a knight, and they will sleep and train together. After these words, he hugs his friend and asks if this isn't a fun enough process. But the protagonist, who had already gone through all this stage in his past life, again answered nothing with a sad face, just thought about the words of his friend, realizing that everything is not as fun as he thinks. There were several classes that were further ordered by Commander Cassiar to be formed just so they could build up their strength and adapt to the mother they have. There were also personal ability development classes for everyone to become stronger, as well as a writing class. We can even see how some girl hit a guy so hard that he flew off. But there were no disputes and conflicts between them, because the guy said that it was okay because he was stung. But at the same time, now he came to his senses. In spite of the very strict training schedule that was made for them, all the guys were aware of the honor given to them, and trained not for life but for death. That's why all the training was so tough. It is because of such intense training, already after a few weeks, the fighters quickly achieved amazing results that they would not have been able to achieve without the grueling training processes. At this point, we are shown the power of the 2 twin brothers, who incredibly increase in size. Naturally, everyone else is very surprised. After all, they are getting bigger every day and destroyed all the training stuffed animals at once. The boys were told to attack them if there was someone strong enough to do it. But suddenly, they turn around and see the silhouette of a guy who is on one of the balconies. They recognize the silhouette of this guy as Yudo and wonder what he's doing there. But the protagonist immediately jumps off the balcony, head first. After only a couple of precise movements, he also destroyed all the training dummies, and all the people who saw it thought his abilities were incredible. They are very much surprised by this, because unlike the guys who increase in size, the protagonists were able to chop all the Scarecrow in one fell swoop and did not even use his ability. At this point, the protagonist is approached by his old friend and says that he is great with a sword, and also wondered if Yudo is not tired. But the protagonist said that he is fine. Of course, Not expecting anything else from his friend, Hakane said that he was about as he thought. After all, according to him, it is very similar to the protagonist. At this moment, our protagonist once again thought about something. It turns out in his past life when he was training, no one dared to even look into his eyes. He realizes that it would seem that nothing has changed, and he is also the owner of such an impressive power as before. But why then everything has changed, and people dare to look him in the eye and talk to him? For him, it is completely incomprehensible. At this point, his friend interrupts the guy from his thoughts and asks how he managed to do it. But the protagonist says that he only needs to give as little weight as possible on his knees. After 3 long months of grueling training, all the awakened fighters were gathered, and dressed in their tunics, their commander reappeared before them. First of all, Cassiar said that he would like to thank them for the fact that despite the lack of any organization in their training, they nevertheless followed all the training sessions faithfully and did not stray from the regimen. According to the commander, during those 3 months, he was only testing their limits, and it was all to define and establish the cavalry corps system, and at last they were able to do it and finish what they had started. At this point, he interrupts a bit and says that this is why all people must now make a choice that will be based on their training experience. At first, all the fighters are surprised, but the commander decides to bring a little clarity to your words and says that now the boys need to join a division within the cavalry corps itself. He emphasizes that there are 3 options to choose from, among them, the warrior division, which is suitable for those with physical abilities, a division of masters that is created for those whose power is similar to magic and who possess a similar power. And the last 3rd division is the division of scientists, where all the others will gather to research something new and technical and strategic progress of the empire. At the same time, the commander says that he is not asking the guys to make a choice right now, because if they have doubts, they can visit their commander's office at any time, so they should decide on their choice by the end of the week and report to him personally. While walking down the hallway, the protagonist talks to Gakane, who asks his friend where he will go and remarks that he will probably choose the Master's Division. But the protagonist is not going to answer so quickly and only wonders where his friend will go. It turns out that Gakane wants to go to the Warriors, while he was certainly thinking about the Masters. But after thinking about all aspects of the Division Onoa during training, he decided that he would rather go to the Warriors. The protagonist wonders how he lost at this choice. And then his friend said that he has the ability to summon his shadow at any moment. But for some reason, it seems to him that his power does not end there, and he realizes that he could be better. And so he thinks that the division of warriors is more suitable for him. Naturally, the protagonist is a bit surprised at this kind of thinking, and wonders if this guy managed to think of such a thing in just 3 months. All because he realizes that it will take some time for everyone to realize that the abilities of the awakened can be developed, and everything depends only on the conditions and the efforts made by the man himself. But at the same time, there has already been a significant progress in the opinion of the protagonist. But unlike his friend Yuno cannot decide where to go, he realizes that in the past, without a second thought, joined the Division of Masters and immediately became deputy commander. But he also realizes that if he wants to create a different future, he should not choose the Masters Division again and should join the Warriors. He realizes that if he joins the Warriors, he will encounter Cassior a little more often. And it turns out that Cassior is the man who is fluent in strength and speed, who is also able to defend himself from any attack thanks to his superior control over his body. According to the protagonist, this young man was an incredible commander in a past life, although he is very reluctant to admit it. And only now, being in this life, the protagonist realized how much the commander cared about the cavalry corps. But he is still tormented by one question to which he could not get answers in the past life. He wonders why, in that case, if the commander cared so much for the cavalry corps, he handed him the position of commander and stepped down. After a while, when Yudo is walking through the corridors, some girl approaches him and asks him to wait for her for a while. She has information. Naturally, the protagonist doesn't immediately realize what's going on, but the girl says that she and Jody just went to the commander's office to report on their chosen division, and the commander suddenly mentioned the guy. Naturally, at first, the protagonist doesn't understand how this could have happened and asks if he realized that it was the commander himself. And then the girl says that it was, and says that since he's the only one who hasn't made up his mind yet, The commander asked if these people had any idea who he could join. At this point, the protagonist wonders if the commander said anything more about him. But then the girl says that she doesn't remember anything like that, and also says that the commander probably asked about it without any special intention, because she and Gakane are the most in touch with him. But the protagonist naturally doubts her words, because he assumes that the commander probably did not just try to find out about the choice of the guy. But at that moment, the girl interrupts his thoughts and says that since they are talking about it, and even the commander thinks that they are close enough, she asks if the protagonist thinks that it would be possible to finally talk in a less formal way. According to her, they freely talk to Gakane on a first-name basis, and therefore she does not understand why she is worse. This surprises the protagonist a bit, and as he looks at Kana, he suddenly sees Gakane next to her, who tells the girl that she was very brave and is glad that she was finally able to say that to the protagonist. But Yuno immediately parries the girl's words, noting that it's because his friend has been speaking to him on a first-name basis from the beginning. Naturally, neither Gakane nor Kana could have expected such a response. They were left stunned, but suddenly Gakane remembers that everything was indeed exactly as Yuno said. And at that time, the girl realized that it was a misunderstanding between them. Then she says that, to be completely honest, she was very much worried about it. But since they were able to clear everything up, now she will also talk to the main character informally. As usual, Yuno rather emotionlessly tells the girl to do as she sees fit, and Gakane congratulates her on the fact that she can now be calm about it. Not long after this conversation, the protagonist headed to the commander's office. He finds it very strange to come to the room he used for 10 years in his past life. It turns out that in his past life, the protagonist used the office of the previous commander as if nothing had happened, although he killed him with his own hands. In his opinion, the Duke of Pellet must have turned over in his grave from such insolence of their cold-bloodedness. These thoughts give the protagonist goosebumps, but the protagonist's thoughts were not even going to stop there. He suddenly wonders if Commander Cassiar knew when he gave him the position that he would be sent to eliminate him for good. But the protagonist realizes that, understanding the situation of the nobles and the imperial family, the former commander must have known that such an order could come, and so he realizes that he made this choice consciously. But now it is the commander is the very person who by all means need to save and lure to his side to change the future that came in the past life, while in the past, the protagonist had to kill him with his own hands. But this time, he is going to change everything for the better. And also the protagonist realizes that it will be very problematic to execute this plan if the cashier cannot hold the position of commander. And further, during these thoughts, the protagonist decides to finally knock on the door to his commander. But by an unexpected coincidence, the door immediately opens in front of him, and he sees before him an astonished commander, who naturally also did not expect to see his fighter here. After a brief moment of awkwardness, the commander immediately said that he had already begun to think about the protagonist often and wondered when he would visit him, while the commander called the protagonist the best examiner of all and was very happy that they had met. He immediately asks the young man if he has finally decided on the division he wants to join, and then the protagonist says that this is indeed the case. Well notes that since the commander is leaving, then he will visit him later. But the commander can't wait to find out what the guy chose, and says he doesn't need to come back later because everything is fine, and he didn't have anything planned, and he just wanted to go out for a while. After a short walk through the corridors of the castle, the protagonist saw the sacred sword of Or, which in the past bothered him a lot, because it always guarded the commander's office. The main character even seems to think that the sword has become even more impressive than it was in his previous life. Noticing the guy's gaze that fell on the sword, the commander immediately turning to him asks if this sword is truly incredible. Also, according to him, other parts of the room are usually the first thing that catches his eye, and that's why no one pays much attention to him. But the main character immediately says that the sword just seemed to him a little unusual, and that's why he looked at it so closely. Of course, the commander at first did not understand why the guy this sword seemed unusual, and immediately asked him about it. But the protagonist is not confused and says that when he looks at this sword, it feels like it's aimed right at him. But he also thinks that since it hasn't been officially announced that Commander Cassiar is the owner of the sacred ball, he should pretend like he doesn't know anything about it. But the commander just laughs in response and, extending his hand, conducts unusual spells that surprise the protagonist. And then the commander said that the guy does not seem, and the sword is really aimed at him. At this point, he tells the guy that he realized that Yunu can even feel a decrease in energy. Then the protagonist did not hide. I said something really like that, and emphasized that this is the first time he sees a sword of such incredible power, but the commander is not as simple as it may look at first glance. He immediately doubts the words of the guy that he first saw such a sword, and emphasizes that he is sure that the guy has heard of this sword before. Of course, the protagonist is very surprised, and even puzzled. But then, the commander says that in his opinion, there is no one who wouldn't know the story of the Emperor Founder and his sacred sword Or. At this point, he looks quite calm, unlike the main character who seems to be thinking about something. It turns out the protagonist was so thoughtful, solely because he assumed that the commander might have guessed that it wasn't the first time he'd seen this particular sword. But then, pretending to be a simpleton, the protagonist asks, "Is this really the sword?" Then the commander tells him that this is the case, but emphasizes that it is more correct to say that he is its 12th owner, while the commander also emphasizes that the sword is capricious small and obeys only whoever he wants. Also, by the way, Cassiar says that so far he has seen many people awakened by the power of the red stone. However, he is the first on his monument who is so sensitive to the energy. The protagonist is once again played for a fool and asked if this is really the case. But the commander does not rush to answer his words, and only asks the boy whether it was only since the moment of awakening, or whether he was more sensitive to mania and other energies than other people before. But the protagonist says that it was after awakening. Then the commander unobtrusively says that he understands everything, and also says that he wants to confess something. He says that he was also present among the examiners on the day when he showed everyone his ability. Then the protagonist notices that it was the commander who touched the water around the sword, at which point the commander once again emphasizes that he is quite sensitive to energy since he identified it so quickly, and believes that the guy has a rather rare talent. It turns out that the commander himself thought that it would be suitable for both warriors and masters, but if the protagonist has to decide, his choice will most likely fall on the latter, while the commander naturally admits that he may be wrong and directly asks the protagonist about it. At that moment, Yuno looked at his commander and seemed to be thinking. But even through his thoughts, he remembered Cassiar's words that his ability was very suitable for the master's division. And it was not bad that he was able to determine the best direction for his talent before the others. It is quite strange for Uno to hear different words from the same person in the same place, but he immediately decides to say which division he chose, and tells the commander that he wants to choose TV warriors. At first, the commander looks a little puzzled, and immediately asks if it is true, to which the protagonist responds positively. Then, hearing such a confident answer, the cashier asks why the protagonist made such a choice. But he only says that during his training, he just realized that he wants to move more in this direction. Of course, the commander has nothing left but to say that he understands. But he still asks the guy if he would have made the same choice in favor of warriors if he knew 100% that his talent could blossom much stronger and faster only in the master's division. But the protagonist immediately replied that of course he would have made the same choice, arguing that he had also thought about the unfavorable outcome. Of course, the commander is a bit surprised by this response, but still thinks it's a very interesting decision, and the reasoning behind it. The commander also says that it's common to take another person by surprise, and they'll start to hesitate, even if they've carefully considered their decision before. But he still thinks the protagonist's choice is excellent and asks him to take care of the warrior division. The protagonist is of course glad that the commander does not insist that he choose the master division, but such a calm response also makes him a little unhappy and even a little disappointed. In the form of the protagonist's face, which emits incomprehensible emotions, the commander asks if he wants to say something else to him, and then addressing the commander as well as the duke, the protagonist tried to answer him something. But the commander interrupted him and said that in this place he is the commander and not the duke, and therefore it is necessary to address him as the commander. He immediately emphasizes that according to the law of their empire, status does not take precedence over rank, and no doubt many can ignore that. but while he is here, the rank of commander will suffice. Then Yuno addressing the commander as it should be, wondering if he can ask why he created this place. The commander naturally a little surprised by such a question, and asked whether the guy means this building or the entire cavalry corps. But the protagonist, without hesitation, said that of course the second. Then the commander said that even His Majesty, the Emperor of the Empire, did not ask him about such a thing, and he was the first who decided to ask, so he wanted to clarify it. But the protagonist did not answer anything, and just humbly waited for an answer to his question. Then the commander said that the reason for the creation of this corps is quite simple, and it is only that the force must be used in the right direction, because in his opinion, if you try to contain it or destroy it, you will surely pay for the violation of harmony. And especially as a man who has the same power as the rest of the fighters, he thought he should pave the way before that power compromised the security of their empire. And besides, as the only awakened member of the imperial family, he felt he was best suited for the role. But knowing how things turned out in his past life, the protagonist immediately asks whether Cassiar will then continue to lead the cavalry corps. But the commander laughed and said that this is a very unusual question. He thought that the guy does not ask this question, and because of his ambitions, and asked, does he really want to take this place? But the protagonist, of course, said that it is not so, and asked how this is even possible. But mentally, he's a little annoyed, as if he's asking the commander to put these jokes aside and just give him an answer that will bring clarity to the future of the entire planet. Then the commander really, as if read his mind, and says that for the time being, everything will be like that. But as soon as the divisions are determined, he is thinking of choosing a deputy commander who will help him in his work. He also emphasizes that, with his abilities like the main characters, he could have taken the position, and he even seriously asks the main character what he thinks about it. But Yuno naturally realizes that he can't agree to this proposal. After all, he specifically chose the warrior division to change his destiny, and so in no way can become the deputy commander again. Realizing this, he got up from his seat and said that he is not suitable for this position. After all, his social skills are terrible and he will not be able to build good relationships with others. Of course, this answer surprises the commander. He even started laughing unexpectedly loudly, being quite surprised at what he heard. In his own words, he never would have thought the guy had such a soft side. At the same time, he calmed down and said that certainly social skills and friendliness are good qualities, but this alone will not be enough to attract people to his side. In his opinion, it is necessary to remember that the power that the guy has is not given to him from birth. And perhaps he is used to the former life, so at the moment he feels insecure about his position. But according to him, there is a possibility that in a few years, his opinion will change dramatically. According to the commander, this will happen even if now the guy doesn't understand what he's talking about. But of course, the main character is not as simple as the commander might think. And he says that of course he understands everything, which naturally surprised the commander again. He emphasized that the doors of his office are always open, which means that if there are any questions, the protagonist can come to him at any time without hesitation. But while allowing for the possibility that the commander won't be there, he says that if he's not there, in that case, the guy just can take his words to the assistant commander who will be assigned. Walking out the door of that room, the protagonist realizes that only 2 years have passed since the Awakened appeared in the world, and the commander is incredibly well aware of their influence on the future, which surprises him a bit. At the same time, he characterizes his commander as a very cunning man, and finally realizes that, thanks to him received very useful information, the protagonist guessed that Cassiar originally did not plan to pass the place of commander to someone else. But after realizing this, he becomes and not at all understandable why, then the commander still left his position to the protagonist and returned to his homeland. In his opinion, first need to learn the secret, and then it will be seen. After a still short time, the composition of all the divisions was finally determined, and the pay of the men of the cavalry corps was equal to that of the knights of the imperial order. After that, the commander of the Cassiar made an announcement about the awarding of the patrimonial name to those members of the corps who do not have it, which caused a war of amazement among the soldiers. Of course, the soldiers are very happy about it, and are surprised that now they serve the imperial palace, and they could not even imagine such payments, which are equal to the salary of an official of the third class. In their opinion, with such a salary, they will be no different from the imperial order. And one of the guys thinks that at once he should write to his family about it. Their joy at this time is watched by the protagonist and his friend. Walking through the corridors, he realizes that everyone is very excited, as suddenly he hears that the soldiers say that even if they are accused of any crime, they will be immune. But the protagonist, of course, realizes that this is not true, because no one will not remain without punishment. And in the end, everything will be decided by the emperor and the commander of the cavalry corps. And at this point, our today's video is over. If you want to see the continuation of this interesting manga, then be sure to subscribe to the channel, put a like under the videos, and do not forget to click on the bell to not miss the next part. And in order for it to come out, we need to collect under this video 5.000 likes or 40.000 views. Share the video with friends to make it happen faster. Goodbye, everyone.